So I would like to ask you, Mariel, why have there been so many indigenous peoples movement and social movement protests against mining in Latin America in general and in Guatemala specifically?
Yeah, well, there are a number of reasons, but I'm going to try to give just some reasons. During the 90s, indigenous people and indigenous peoples organizations gained a more political space, but both nationally and internationally. So, and with that, they have managed to bring to the discussion table issues that are of their concern. Mm-hmm. And then they have had, at the international level, important political victories, like the inclusion of their concerns in special charters in the UN, and the fact that several more governments have signed, for instance, the International Labour Organization, what's the name of that? The Convention on the Rights of Indigenous and Tribal People. And at the same time, at the national scale, they have also managed to bring concerns of indigenous people into constitutions. And we have, for instance, the case of Ecuador and Bolivia, which are perhaps where they have advanced the most. But also the constitutions of other countries like Guatemala and Nicaragua have taken into consideration the right of indigenous people, or declared that the countries are that there are more different indigenous group within the country. So when the advancement of extractive industries, because mining is one of them, but that is connected to other industries as well, started to be more prominent in the subcontinent, indigenous people have felt that their rights have been violated. And in many cases, conflicts are related to the way in which companies and governments and the state treat indigenous people and how they ignore their rights or their demands. In other cases, it's also been related to internal fights within different segments of the indigenous movement. Also, in some cases, is motivated because indigenous people feel that they have the right to participate in decision making about the things that will happen in their territories. And companies usually lie about the intentions or about the things that they are planning to do in the territories of the people. And also because one central element in all these disputes is access to land and to the right to decide over their territories. And those are processes that have not been solved completely in any of the countries, even when there have been many advances, for instance, in Bolivia and in Colombia, but the issues are not settled. So it still requires the involvement of indigenous people and indigenous organizations to continue that fight for their rights to the territories and to the land.
Mm-hmm. There has been many social protests in Guatemala the last years. What caused them to start? How did they start?
Yeah, where should I start? I think that after the signing of the peace agreements in '96, there were some issues or problems that have just become worse and worse with time. One of the problems is that political parties in Guatemala are not representative of anything more than their own interests and the interests of those who finance the politicians that want to get into power. Okay. So there are limited political spaces for participation in general in Guatemala if one thinks about the formal politics. Mm-hmm. So one way of getting away from that limitation is to protest, and that is what many organizations have been doing the last years. Having said that, it's also important to stress that civil society in Guatemala is very strong and is very well organized. But the way of channeling demands into a formal political system, that doesn't exist. And then that's why we see mobilizations on the streets on the one hand, and many other different forms of claiming spaces for participation, for participating in politics. And on the other hand, we see many cases being brought to the courts, because this, to me, is a sign of the lack of political spaces for legitimate participation.
Mm. Could the lack of transparency and illicit financial flows and the grey economy be part of the explanation why there has been so many corrupt governments in Guatemala during the last 25 years?
Yeah, that's part of the explanation, but it's a little bit more complex, because what happens is that through history, different elites that compete for maintaining control over the state and its resources and access to that, they have been. It's not that this has been without their conflicts inside the elite, but they solve their conflicts somehow so that they can continue maintaining the power of that over the state and over the resources of the state. But one of the mechanisms that has allowed them to maintain control over the state and its resources is through illegal financing of political parties. So this is at the heart of what is in dispute now in Guatemala. Because once you get involved in this illegal financing, then you get into access to take control over the resources of the state, and then that gives you the possibility to continue enriching or getting resources that again can be used to finance the next candidate or whatever. Now, the problem, or one of the problems, is that because of history and because of the role of the army in the civil war and how they got involved in illegal activities like drug trafficking and other type of illegal commerce, they also gained economic power and have been in the position to also finance political parties. So the CICIG, we can talk about that later, but they published a study that reveals that there are three major financiers of political parties. One is the traditional elite, or one could say, the groups that one usually associates with elite. Then the other one is a group that became enriched by getting contracts with the state. So that at some point they were serving the economic elite in getting these contracts, and then they themselves became enriched, and then they are using those resources now to finance political parties. And the third one is all the illegal actors, like drug traffickers, for instance.
But what has the large illegal and grey economy in Guatemala done to the rule of law and to the courts?
I think that you cannot separate things in that context. I think that it's difficult to put the blame only on the illegal funding of political parties or the illegal economy. Is the whole system of how law has been, and the judiciary, one can say, has been inefficient in guaranteeing the rights of the whole population. And this happens, of course, because the system can be corrupted through all these actors, but it's also a close link to the racism that defines Guatemalan society. So some parts of the system that doesn't work, nobody has ever thought that we need to do something with that, because indigenous peoples have been, through history, seen as a second category of citizens and not deserving the same treatment in front of the law.
It has been said that in Guatemala that political elites, military structures, and authoritarian regime protect their own. It is often referred to as the illegal structures. Can you explain to us a little bit more what are these illegal structures?
Yeah, well, the term was first used when the Commission on historical, what's the name of that? The historical...
the Truth Commission,
the Truth
you would
Commission,
say.
Yeah. When the Truth Commission started to document how war crimes have occurred. And then what they found out was that within the state there was a faction of the military that had taken control of key institutions and key positions that allow them to get into deals with illegal actors. So they were more operators between what was legal and illegal actors. And in that process, they became millionaires, many of them, but they also managed to keep control of, as I said, key institutions and key positions within the state. And that, even when this is something that has been known since the peace negotiation, is not until now that we are beginning to understand the texture of the threads that wave corruption and illegality in Guatemala. So you can, what one can think is that there was there is the formal state in Guatemala, or the formal state apparatus, and in the shadow there's another structure operating and manipulating what is on the legal side. And then we have seen, for instance, people who should go to trial, and then they are never prosecuted, and the judges simply ignore the claims that have been done against these people. Or for many years it was very difficult to bring former military to courts. But that started to change around, I will say, maybe 2010, started to change in what was visible. Because back since there's been a long and sustained work of civil society actors that push towards the end of impunity and the end of these parallel structures. But we cannot say that the battle has been won yet. It's still going on. What I think is very positive now is that, and that is, I also think is very much related to the work that has been done by journalists, by independent media, that they didn't have any links or connections to the traditional elite, and then they were much freer to do good work. And this work has, maybe some years ago it was, you have to be very particularly interested in the theme to get to know all the details or understand what was going on. But now this media has brought things into the public sphere, and it's been made a subject of discussion. And that, I think, is a very important difference in the things that have changed in Guatemala.
But what do we know about how the illegal structures are cooperating with traditional elites and commercial companies?
This is a very difficult question. I don't think I can answer it directly, but there are indications about how they work. And these indications we can conclude from the cases that have been revealed by the CICIG and the Attorney General Office on how, for instance, I'm going to try to make it very, very simple. But for instance, let's say that you were a constructor entrepreneur, and you wanted to be able to gain some of the contracts with the government. Then that contractor was supposed to compete for a good bid, but before that, that contractor had financed the political campaign of the politician that now is in power, right? So then this company presents an offer for a bid that is maybe 10 times as expensive as it would have been if the company didn't have to pay the politician and others involved. And then that part, let's say that it was going to cost 1 million, and then the bid is for 10 million, and those 9 million are divided between the politician and other people who is behind. How this money gets into being legal? There has to be somewhere something done so that these 10 millions then can be used to other things. So I suspect, but this I don't have any empirical evidence to say that, but I suspect that the banks and financial institutions have played a role. It's only that I don't know what is the role that they have played, or I cannot explain you all the details on how this has happened. But there has to be obvious some complicity, maybe not directly complicity, but that you just look on the other direction in these cases, for instance.
That leads me to very also another big question. How to fight corruption in a country when the government itself is such an important part of the problem? The UN has done something historical with the introduction of something called CICIG.
Mm-hmm.
Could you please explain what is CICIG and what exactly is their mandate in Guatemala?
Yeah, CICIG is by its Spanish name is the Commission against the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. And this is in reality is an experiment, because it's something that has never been done before in the world. And when they agree on having this agreement, nobody really knew what was going to happen. And let's say that the first 10 years CICIG was there, but yeah, they investigated some big crimes, but their work didn't have had a huge effect in the public consciousness of what was going on. The mandate of the CICIG is to support the Attorney General Office in the investigation of these parallel structures, illegal bodies within the state. So in 2015, finally came some cases that reach the collective imagination, let's say, when they started to reveal how politicians and private actors or from the private sector have been involved in both illegal financing of political parties, but also in many other corruption cases. And in 2000, I think, but at that point it was the politicians, it was former president, former vice president, and the cabinet that have been involved in these cases. But in 2000, I think it was 2016, so came a case in which members of one of the most prominent families in Guatemala were involved in robbing the states, the resources of the state, taking bribes for getting contracts with the companies and between the companies and the state. And that, I think, that I think has made a huge difference in the perception of what corruption is about in Guatemala. Because it has allowed the Guatemalan people to see that it's not the, shameless, isolated politician that is selfish and wants to enrich itself through the state. But it has shown the degree of cooperation and alliance between the one segment of the private sector and politicians. And I think that there are many things that need to be changed before one can think that now we have dealt with the problem of corruption. But this is at least a start, that people realize how it works and what is the cost and what it means for all of the people in the country.
But what consequences, what cost would you say that lack of transparency and people knowing about this has had for Guatemala?
Well, you have a state that cannot finance the most basic things a state is supposed to finance, like education and health. And that is, okay, you can say maybe some 15 years ago, people in Guatemala will say, yeah, it's politicians who just steal everything and they are corrupt. But now we can see that the thing is more complex and that it involves other actors. That's one thing. But another thing that I have been thinking very much about is the issue of trusting people, trusting that we are working towards a common goal, or and I will say that this trust and being able to know that what happened to your taxes, for instance, that you will know, and if it doesn't go the way it should be, then you will also know. That is, for me, some sort of a glue in society that keeps people together and that makes people able of cooperating in other instances. So I think that, of course, that is not the only explanation, because we have 36 years of civil war, and then you have 500 years of history, of colonial history. But one part of that is this mistrust, that one needs to do something about that, and that comes with transparency. I think at least one part of it.
You have also been mentioning the word impunity. Can you explain to us what does really impunity is? What does it mean, and how does it affect the trust in society?
Yeah, impunity means that people who commit crimes can just never be judged, go ahead with it, or get ahead with it, or how do you say it?
Get away with it.
Get away with it, yeah. But also, what is interesting is that in Guatemala you see this difference between who you are and how strict the law is going to be. So the poorer you were, the more probabilities there will be that you will end in jail for a minor, minor crime, let's say. Whereas if you were standing in a higher position in society, the probabilities for you being judged were lower. In Guatemala, 97% of the crimes are never investigated, never go to courts, never judged. So it's very little that get punished in a way of things that should not be done by citizens. And then it's also, it gets this idea that you can get away with a lot of things if you are not a poor man, because I guess they are the ones who are more often ending in jail.
How do you see the illegal networks and the impunity developing in Latin America today, or perhaps more internationally? Are there any connections? What do you see?
Yeah, I think that is very interesting, because I was in Guatemala some weeks ago, and I was having a discussion with a group of judges in Guatemala, and they're trying to form a group at Latin American associations of judges against impunity, motivated by the case of Odebrecht. I think that's the way you say that. And that is a Brazilian company, construction company, that has had contracts with many governments across Latin America. And in, I think, most of the countries where they have had contracts, one has found out that they had illegal and corrupt dealings with the governments and with politicians. So that means that because more and more transnational companies are operating across the subcontinent, and not only Latin American but other types of companies also, that these type of challenges needs to be faced by common efforts in several countries at the same time, because the pattern is there. You know, it's not this happening in Brazil, but nobody else heard about that anywhere else. But you see, it's Peru, it's Guatemala, it's Nicaragua, it's many different countries, the same pattern of relationship between the bribes and corruption from the company to politicians.
Beate Thoresen, Norwegian People's Aid is one of the largest Norwegian organizations. It is perhaps also the organization which historically has been focusing most on the relationship between political freedom and social and economic justice. What do you or Norwegian People's Aid mean by economic justice?
Well, for us it's almost a natural thing to focus on economic justice. We have our roots in the labor movement in Norway, and we have been working in many countries with high degree of inequality. So we decided at one point that we could not just look at who are the poor and how do we fight poverty, which of course is important, without looking at why are people poor and what are the structures behind it. So our main slogan for the programs is just distribution of power and resources. Of course, you distribute resources, power you have to gain, but we decided that we needed to look at how can you deal with this incredibly skewed distribution of resources in a society. And one of the reasons why that is important is that it perpetuates itself. And when a very small group has an enormous amount of resources, they also have a huge political influence over the state, as Mariel has described. So that's why we started to think about this. So what do we think about when we talk about economic justice? We think that it has to do both with the way the resources are distributed in a society, how equally people have access to resources, but it also has to do with equity in terms of social and political, not just rights, but actually power.
But you have a long personal history also with Latin American societies and social movements. But relative to Africa and Asia, social movement seems to be reasonably strong in Latin America. But still, the differences between rich and poor are larger in Latin America than anywhere else in the world. And why has it proved so difficult to achieve economic justice in Latin America?
It has to do with concentration of power and it has to do with concentration of resources and how this is linked together. If you look at Guatemala, for example, sort of the historic example you would use is that 1 or 2% of the population owns 70% of the land that you can cultivate, and this sort of structural injustice, which is in the rooting of the country, combined with a high level of discrimination of the indigenous population, has sort of spilled over in the whole system over years, and one earlier it was more common in Latin America to use military dictatorships to keep that in order to keep the power in the hands of a few. There was a close link between military and economic elites. Today that is not so important, so I think that it's not used so much anymore. There's not many military dictatorships in Latin America, but there is still a lot of power played out behind the scenes, and I think in order to understand how these structures work, you have to look at these powers behind the scenes and how they operate. Look at, for example, Guatemala. In the peace accords, it was stated that Guatemala would go from having a tax income of 9% of the budget, of the gross national product, to 12%. I'm not sure about the number in Norway, but it would be like 45%. And still, I don't think they have reached that goal. Why is that happening? And it is, you end up with a combination of very complicated processes where you have small elites that actually have capacity to influence how laws are made through partly corrupt mechanism, but also to say that the state is quite dependent on the income they actually get from these groups, and you have a state where there's enormous corruption, and then people are not very willing to pay more taxes to a state that we say it will be robbed, I won't get any education anyhow. So you get a sort of very vicious circle from these kind of systems. And I remember that in Norway there was this commission to study capital flights and how that affected countries. And one of the conclusions that I think was very important was that when you have tax havens, when people can take the money out of the country, and when you have very corrupt and not transparent structures, there's no incentives from the elites to build strong institutions, and you end up with institutions that doesn't work for anyone. And I think that's part of the crisis now, that suddenly you are in a situation where this structure doesn't even work for the elites. So you have a sort of a breakdown of how the state works. So it's been, there are strong social movements. I think a lot of the advances that you can see both with respect to the justice system, to, for example, CICIC and all these investigations about corruptions, but also in other areas, you can actually go back to and see that these have been demands of social movements. They have been, in spite of everything, the ones who have pushed for the reforms that are there. It came, the human rights movements were extremely important for the creation of CICIC, for example. But when it comes to the economic reforms, they have achieved less.
But for the developing country, they would also need foreign investments and a functional financial sector in order to create jobs and development. But extreme poverty seems to continue to be a serious problem in Guatemala more than 20 years after the civil war ended. So why has not peace and democracy and economic growth and foreign investment ended hunger and extreme poverty? There has been investments.
Yeah, there has been investments. But basically, the resources are not distributed. If you look at how this has happened after the peace accords were signed, there was a lot of expectations there, because the peace accord actually was an agenda for social and economic reform. It wasn't just sort of put down your arms and how do we pacify the country. It was an idea of how can we build another state. And a lot of organizations were very much engaged in pushing for these reforms. But basically, after the peace was signed, the economic policies that were introduced were not sort of building a welfare state economic policies, but much more a neoliberal kind of policy, a lot of privatization of state enterprises, and very little investment sort of in building a state that could redistribute resources. And in such a structure, when you get investments, you may create some employment that can be positive for the also for the poorer part of the population. But in the end, they end up with quite few and low salaries, very few rights, and the gains of the economic activities are not contributing to a welfare state that could benefit the whole population. So you end up without sort of you get investments but not social development.
We also have seen examples from Guatemala that international businesses have been proposing to pay lower wages than is the minimum wage in Guatemala, and using their power for a potential investment to squeeze ordinary people. Is that a usual way of doing business in Guatemala?
I think there are many different ways of doing business in Guatemala. I do think it's important not to say that every businessman in Guatemala or woman are corrupt and pushing for lower salaries and not respecting labor rights. But yes, it is a tendency to do that. And you know that a lot of the enterprises coming in with foreign investments, they have already negotiated that they do not have to pay the taxes for a longer period of time when there's investment and until the start of. There may be reasons for that, but I think it's important to come back to then look at in which society does this investment come in? Because if you asked about the conflicts around mining, for example, but if you are in a community when your main experience is that people take resources from you, they are actually taken away, you lose land, you get less resources, and from the state you get almost nothing. So, and even from the state in the rural area, you almost got more before, because you had at least technicians or people who would work with small farmers to improve their crops and so on. All these systems are gone now, because it's seen that this is not the role of the states. So in that setting, you get investments and people think, okay, there's one more coming in to take away our resources and plunder what we have, and of course you get conflict in such a situation. So I think there's and this makes also investments quite difficult. Yeah.
So it seems to be quite difficult when the investment seems to be actually reinforcing existing power and keeping power in few hands. And beyond public scrutiny by the help of new financial mechanisms. Is that correct?
Yeah. But I also think that there are some... this looks like a sort of very critical situation where you can't get out. So I think there's also important to point at sort of some of the positive things that have happened. I think CSIC is one of them. The thing that you actually expose corruption, but not just saying it's corrupt, but you expose how it is happening in the ways so that this is more clear, because that was not easy to. You always knew that it was like that, but it wasn't clear how. I think that's one of the things, and I also think that, for example, the SAT, the tax authorities in Guatemala, you now know about where tax income come from. You can actually look at the figures and see what are the income of the state. I think these kind of things are positive, and it's also being used much more by social movements to push the state for more openness. But you really need to push, and I think what you see in social movements today in Guatemala, you continue with some of the sort of basic contradictions that you have had that have mobilized people for a very long time, which is the issue of land and access to resources in rural areas. And where you have achieved very little. And then you have got a new kind of mobilization, which is around impunity and corruption. And this is interesting, because this is the first time in many years that middle class is mobilizing. Because you would be used to see that peasants' organizations or small indigenous organization would be marching into Guatemala City in protest. But it has been many years since middle class also went out to the streets and take this, and that gives a certain hope for a stronger push against these sectors. And a lot of these open sort of access to information and is used by these movements today.
It's good to hear that there are so many positive developments in Guatemala. Do you, Mariel, also believe that Guatemala has now perhaps turned a corner, that we're seeing the start of something positive happening in Guatemala finally?
I would like to say, but I don't know. I think that I'm sitting and observing what is going on right now, and there's hope. But I think these are long process that maybe we are not going to see it in the short term, but it will take more years. But what I wanted to say also in relation to what Beate was saying is that also the international some international standards, for instance, have proven to be positive for changes within the industry in Guatemala. And we have the case of African palm production, and a particular company that polluted a very important river in Guatemala and killed many forms of life, of aquatic life, and people from the place were crying when they saw how many animals have died by this pollution. And this was taken by some organizations up to different levels, and the company now has lost contract with the most important European customers, saying, and also the revelations from CSIC indicated that the owners of that company have evaded taxes. So first, one international company said, we are not going to do any more deals with you because you are polluting rivers and destroying nature. And then the second bigger client said, because you haven't clarified your situation in relation to corruption, the allegations of corruption, we are not going to make any more deals with you. The company, I have heard that they are in serious trouble because they lost their biggest clients. But this show how you can bring things from the local scale to international scale, and then that go back to the national scale through cooperation between different actors. And I think that it also highlights how important it is that people have access to information at several levels, because then they can bring these up to different spheres. And this, for instance, in the case in this river, it was like local journalists that they were filming with their mobile phones what was going on and what was happening. So they didn't have to wait until the main media or the other forms of media came to document what was happening, but they could do that. And back to your question. It's interesting. I have the feeling that Guatemala is always about to go that big step and say like, okay, now is the future. But it's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to say.
I would, if I can add, I would think that I think there are positive signs that there's more information, there's more mobilization, there's more organizing around these issues. But one of our big concerns now is that there's also more repression. If you look at not just Guatemala, but also the neighboring country, Honduras, since the elections in October last year, there's at least 35, 38 people killed in clashes with the police, but not just that, but also a sort of clear targeting of those who stand up for example, against in industries or investments or company that affect their land, or demand that their land, the access to land in the countryside, or demand social justice. So we see now that both different organizations, also partners of Norwegian People's Aid, are being killed and targeted because they are working for economic justice. So that is a huge concern, and that also shows how this sort of very unequal structure erodes sort of the democratic institutions of the country. Look at Honduras. This was not a democratic election. It was a coup in many ways, and we know that one of the at least effects of the government that has been in Honduras now over the last years is there have been massive concessions to different enterprises all over the world without consultation, without sort of proper processes in the country. That combined with the repression against social activists and farmers and indigenous people is a huge concern for us.
It's the same as meeting great economic power. I would like now to open for questions from the journalists. Do you have any questions?
Okay, I can try to make a question, but I have maybe 155 questions for you. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the role of the media in Guatemala, because you mentioned it, Mariel, and we know that one of these independent media or autonomous media, Plaza Pública, was founded 7 years ago. And you also said that some things started to change inside the jurisdictional system in Guatemala in 2010. So it's about the same time you see that there is something changing also inside the court rooms, that you are opening up for cases concerning corruption and also former military during the war in Guatemala. And at the same time you see these initiatives for autonomous media. Can we link those two together? Like, was there a space that was open up during this time, and does CICIG has any can we understand this also because of the presence of CICIG, or how can we see this development in Guatemala from the peace agreements, and then you have to wait so many years before you see this? Wanted to connect it, and then maybe if I'm permitted to have 2 questions. We talk a lot about the chilling effect in this when we are doing this study about digital journalism, and as you said, like, repression is increasing both in Guatemala and in Honduras. But something that I learned from both those countries is that nos tienen miedo porque nosotros no tenemos miedo. Like, they're afraid of us because we're not afraid. And I think like the mobilization that we have seen in both countries, and also the initiatives of like always confronting power. This is not like going back. I think the chilling effect, killing activists like we've seen in Guatemala and in Honduras with Berta Cáceres and other journalists, it's I'm not sure if it has a chilling effect on the people working. But maybe the work of Plaza Pública and some judges inside the legal system and many important organizations in Honduras, maybe they have a chilling effect on foreign investment and companies. And do you think there is, do they have a chilling effect on power?
Yeah, should I start?
Good question. I think
we'll talk about this, the role of the media and how they got, and I think what we have seen in Guatemala, I think, is that there's an expansion of the public sphere. And that, of course, doesn't happen overnight. It requires some time. And I will say that it started with the negotiation of the peace agreements, but also when the reports from the Truth Commissions were presented, then it was written, and you can dispute it, and people could blame those who wrote the reports for being on one side or whatever, but the thing is that the documentation was there, and then it was also possible to talk about the war, the causes of the war, and the effects of the war, and in that way, slowly the public sphere started to open. The problem with media in Guatemala has always been that the same business groups that control the economy and politics, to some extent, also control media. And we have also seen that there's a Mexican kingpin, as it's called, a millionaire who owns a lot of media in Latin America and started to consolidate ownership of the media. But then we have internet, and the digital media came in that landscape, in which also more and more people have had access to internet and to mobile phones. And these independent media didn't depend on the financing from these other actors, which, by the way, is also a link to understand how private sector can keep control over politicians, because the media has also play a role, of course. And then these media they want to do something with the status of journalists. They don't want to be treated as always as part of corruption, but they want to do a good work, and it has been received positively. And the more they expose problems, I think somehow they feel more protected. But before that, there have been development of other media in the past that were also trying to push that, So I think it's like the boundary has been pushed from several fronts until the public sphere and the space in which you can debate got expanded. I will say that freedom of expression in Guatemala is strong, and that people want to maintain that strong. It's not. I don't think that in general people will think that is acceptable to censorship media or people for expressing what they think, and that goes in parallel with a different process that is the fight of the civil society for bringing into life CICIG, and that has maybe a little longer history, but they needed to to have good arguments and to have people inside the system that they can trust and that could do the work, and that also doesn't happen overnight, And in many cases, and this is something that you also see in other countries, that they try to find justice outside Guatemala, like in the Inter-American system of the Court of Human Rights, or in Spain, or in other instances, and then the cases come back to Guatemala. in the case from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, with a verdict, and you cannot ignore that. And that also, I mean, the government cannot ignore that, and that also pushes the boundaries. And it is just, I have now met all these judges, that there are many of them who want to do their work, and then it's not that all of them are corrupt. Many of them are decent people, but of course they need support from the system and from society, and that also takes time. So it's been all these processes and negotiations that have gone or happened in this time. Of course, when you think 20 years is 20 years too long for seeing an improvement of the society, but if you think that before that you had 500 years of history, then this 20 years is really a very short time, and changes have happened that are spectacular, I think.
Would you like to answer the other question on the chilling effect?
Well, I do think that one of the reasons why you see increased repression of civil society organizations, people who put forward their demands for economic justice or resist investments in both Guatemala and Honduras. I think one of the reasons now is that they are actually being echoed, and they do have an effect. I think that even if sort of being a famous activist, and like Berta Cáceres was, did not protect her from being killed, I think the effect of her being killed and people continue that struggle that was part of her community struggle has an effect on they haven't kind of slowed down because of the repression, but of course it's a very high cost to have. But then if you and you also see in Guatemala that those who have opposed, for example, investments in hydroelectric power or in mining in the countryside, in the indigenous community, have been very sort of severely punished also by the justice system. It's not just these arbitrary killings. It's also that they are taken to court and they are actually tried, and in spite of a bad justice system. So that is because they are affecting economic interests. And then someone may say they are. It is stupid to resist investments because that could bring the economic development that they would have liked to, but it's not how they see it, and it's not how they experience it. So I'm not so sure that this new wave of repression will sort of stop the social movements. The question is how much will they manage to sort of affect the system, really? How much will they actually manage to influence economic policies? And I think that you're right in that to get changes in that respect will take a long time, and it will take a very long time. But I do think that there is a possibility of playing together between organizations, both within the countries and to push for more openness and at least we have to push for respect for basic human rights and democracy, like we are not doing today in Honduras. So we have to get that work up again. Yeah. Yeah. I do also think that sometimes we think about sort of the state and the social movements, and they are on each other's on different planets. I think in Guatemala you have different ways that the movements and the sort of resisting the present system have survived. it's clear that there's a lot of, especially in indigenous communities, there's a lot of self-organizing that the state actually hasn't much to say about. They have a tradition themselves, so they can actually resist a lot of processes. But I also think that it's important that there's, at the same time, that there has been a sort of interaction between civil society and people in the state. It's very difficult to see the success cases of CICIC without understanding the human rights movements, for example, and that people got experience and got into the state, and that those people in the state had support outside the state. These mechanisms, I think we haven't really sort of figured them out yet, but I think they are very important. But on the other hand, in countries like Guatemala, where there's such a deep-rooted division of the country between different ethnic groups, there's also a sort of very strong distance to the state. So how do you actually start to people to have a dialogue about what kind of country do we have? There's a lot of initiatives about that, reforming the state today. I think that's a long-term project, but that will, I think, only happen not because you force people to have a dialogue, but because these movements are strong enough to go into a dialogue and actually have an effect on them.
The leader of CICIG, Ivan Velasquez, said that the most important thing was the civil society, the media, and just ordinary people and artists protesting and sharing their vision for a new future. Thank you so much, Mariel and Beate, coming here and sharing your experiences and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.